Let's come into Vision 5. And we're experiencing a very interesting way in which to learn. The old way that was inherited from the classical period was to learn by subjects. We're not learning by subjects. We're learning by phases, which is a more primordial way. Our kind of beings learned by phases for hundreds of thousands of years, and forerunners to us fit into nature in such a complete way that they didn't have to learn anything. They just lived. They existed. They were folded into the animal kingdom. They were folded into the plant kingdom and the mineral kingdom in such a way that they were a part of nature. They didn't have to learn. They lived. About halfway between the emergence of our species in southern Africa about 160,000 years ago and ourselves, our particular kind of being underwent a huge change. And the first indication of it is that there were two aspects to that change at the same time. They were paired. In the paleontology record, in the fossils of our kind, you find for the first time jewelry on the women and tools with the men. These are the seeds and the roots of the arts and the sciences. It's the feminine art of the person being expressed in beads, in worked special rocks, in special shells. It's a cosmetic not for fashion, but for personal expression. And so the feminine sense of an individual person emerges about the time that men begin understanding that they can make better tools. One of the great figures in the 20th century was Louis Leakey in Kenya, who grew up with the Kikuyus and was an elder in the Kikuyu tribe, who called himself a white African. And when he went to study in England, he was shocked to realize that he dreamed in Kikuyu, not in English. He learned to make stone tools like primordial human beings made stone tools. Now we know that it goes back to 2 million years. That there was a forerunner to us called Homo erectus, and the one complete Homo erectus skeleton we found was a young man, about 17 years old. He was almost 6 feet tall and athletic, and obviously very capable hunter. And it was Homo erectus 2 million years ago that first left Africa and colonized and populated the rest of the Eurasian landmass. And so we find in places like Beijing, Peking man who lived there and used fire 500,000 years ago, where Peking is. But Peking man was part of the Homo erectus. In Java, Java man is also part of that. It wasn't until our species, Homo sapiens, that there was midway between our origins and now, there was a refinement of making tools. Leakey said, Homo erectus was a very sophisticated being, but he made beautiful tools stupidly. He learned to make a special spear point very well, and in all the 2 million years of Homo erectus, they never made it differently. It was always made just that way. There was no improvement. It seems mind-boggling that after a while, even in the life of one individual, you wouldn't make some variation and change. Not for 2 million years. It means that the ritual comportment was purely like a geologic layer in nature. This was the way things are done, and that's it. But with our species, about 70,000 years ago, waking up to individual expression also woke us up to the fact that we can make our tools better, differently, new tools. And for the very first time, in southern Africa, you find tools that are not made just out of stone, but tools that are made out of antlers and out of bones, for the first time. To see for the first time that one could make a tool out of a different material means that there is something going on here. And what is going on is that there is a new phase that has come into play that was not there in nature before. And this new phase is vision, consciousness. Consciousness that delivers a sense, a different sense, not just of who you are, but of who you might be, given a chance to express yourself, given a chance to develop yourself. You might be a variant of who you are that is preferable. And the same thing with tools that one can now vision. One has some consciousness that transforms. It transforms what is, the way things are done, so that they are now done differently and better, more refined. And so for the last 70,000 years, our species has slowly but increasingly begun to explore this ecology of visionary refinement and transform. And it has become as extensive as the whole natural cycle by our time. So that we must now learn in a way that is increasingly incumbent upon us. We must learn not just who we are from circumstance or condition, or who we might be from a limited range of choices, to seeing the entire scale of who we might be in increasing complexity, because we might be not just one different thing, we might be several hundred ways of expressing a kaleidoscopic self. And so our species have become jewels of life. And the last couple of thousand years have been an acceleration of the refinement of that to an extent where it is now almost a permanent whiz. It's very fast. We go through more evolution now in 10 years than our species used to go through in a century. And coming up, the next generation will be able to go through that evolution year by year to make the kinds of radical changes, if need be, the kinds of layered complexities, if need be, and to live not only anywhere that they choose in town or anywhere they choose on the planet, but anywhere they choose in the star system. You might want to raise your children so that they're going to be at home on Mars, one of the moons of Jupiter, who knows? For this, we needed a new education, and that's what this is. This is pioneering a new form of learning that goes back to the original. It learns by phases. It learns by taking nature in itself and acquainting ourselves with that phase of the natural, and then of how out of that natural process comes the rituals which establish, because we do things in a set sequence, those actions together in this sequence make something happen. They make an objectivity. And so rituals make objective forms. The forms not only of existence, but the forms of our kind of existence. And that out of that interplay comes another process, the process of experience. And that process of experience is similar to nature, but it has three qualities that are not very well developed in nature. They're there somewhat, but they emerge very strongly in experience. And that is, experience has feelings, it has images, and it has language. One is able to speak. And it's out of the further objectification of experience that feelings and images and speaking come together and make a symbolic quality of thought, make a mind, an objective mind that can have ideas now, can have an imagination, has a memory, can have a written language. All of that total ecology opens up. If one understands it by phases and not by subject, it opens up to a fifth phase. As if the four phases of nature now have a center, a fifth phase, a fifth place. Not just the four edges or the four angles, but it has a center. And that center is able now to do something that the integral couldn't do. It can differentiate by several motions that were there in nature but now are transformed. One is it's able to rotate. Not just in the way that nature rotates, but to turn and rotate back the other way. So that one now has a balance of two different kinds of movement. A rotation that is clockwise and a rotation that is counterclockwise. And it means that our species has achieved a kind of a sphericality. Instead of just being on some kind of a circle of nature, where one could have a circle of learning, now we're on a full sphere. And a circle is only a simple cross-section of that sphere, which is thousands, millions of times what that circle was. So that if you live on the whole planet Earth in the southern hemisphere, water goes down the drain the other way. It goes counterclockwise. While it's winter here, it's spring down there. And so one lives on the full globe. You have now a complementarity, not only nature going one way, but you have a conscious ability to turn around and go the other way. You can go either way, or you can weave them together, and when you do, you get a complexity now that wasn't there before. And so when one brings the motion of the rotation in, you get this complex weave of a sphericality, but you have also another kind of movement, and that is radiance, radiation, differentiation. It now sparkles. The center no longer is just a static center, but it has a sparkle to it. It has a radiant quality, as well as a rotational ambidextrousness. We saw in the first four of the vision presentations two classic periods in our species, one from China and one from Alexandrian Egypt. How 2,300 years ago, a huge change happened in the world. the change was that the fifth quintessence phase of consciousness gained a global perspective for the first time in a very easy manner. The two places that exemplified that best on the planet were Alexandria in Egypt and Chang'an in China. And both places were very large international cities 2,300 years ago. They were cities that had people from such disparate parts of the world that they were no longer cities that belonged to any kind of a locale that was less than almost half a year's travel time in between. Alexandria had people from India to Ireland living there. Chang'an had people from Japan to central Russia living there, coming together. And both cities were these kinds of centers of caravan and trade routes, of international contacts and ties, so that the population of people who lived in those cities became radiant to an extent that had never been seen before. They became rotational in a balanced way, so that now one had not just the ambidextrousness, but one had an intensity of this ambidextrousness to where it was able to appreciate consciously things like paradox. And in Chang'an and Alexandria, you find for the first time people who are very similar to us. They get subtlety on a level that other people in the world were not even aware of yet. Levels of subtlety, of irony, of paradox, of sensing that there are possibilities that have never been explored before, and one has every possibility and every right to want to find out, to want to explore and go. And so the range of possibility recalibrates itself from a scale to an infinity. It goes off the scale. One now has such a range of possibility that any scale is just one scale among a number of possible scales. In Alexandria, the scale chosen for most music was an 8-note scale called the octave. In Chang'an, it was a 5-note scale. And Chinese music developed for thousands of years with a pentatonic scale, and Western music developed for thousands of years with an octave scale. And yet, just 3 generations ago, for the very first time at the beginning of the 20th century, there were musicians who for the first time understood that music scales were infinite. One can have any number of scales. And one had around 1900 the introduction of a 12-note scale by Arnold Schoenberg. And for the first time, human beings realized that their capacities to make music was unlimited. You will never have a universe that lasts long enough to exhaust the possibilities of our kind of music, spirit, expressive music. We will never exhaust it. And the same with science. Like arts, the sciences are inexhaustible. They are able to be looked at in a science way which is analytic, as artists look at art in a critique way. Not critical to criticize it, but critiquing to refine it and refine one's appreciation of it at the same time. All these capacities were at one time so new that there were only a few places on the planet that had these capacities, that had these kinds of people. When those places went through a cycle where they were eclipsed, many of those newly discovered qualities went into just being available to a few handfuls of people who remembered, or to a few special individuals who rediscovered them for themselves, but they disappeared largely from the social world for quite a long time. When the classic Roman Empire was suffering from an instability of its own power, it decided to shift its state religion from the Greek gods to the Christian gods. And in order to make them really Roman, they had to steal Christianity from the early Christians. And one of the ways in which they cauterized the theft was to say, well, Christianity has nothing to do with its origins in Judaism, has nothing to do with its origins in Egypt, in Hermetic Egypt, has nothing to do, except in a cursory way, with the educated Greeks, but nothing to do with Greek mythology, or the Greek mystery religions, or the Persian religions of Mithra and so forth. And yet, archaeology shows again and again that wherever you found early Christian churches for the first 300 years, you also found synagogues and you found Mithraeums. There were more Mithra temples in the Roman Empire than there were Greek god temples or Christian churches. Everywhere. And one finds Mithras slaying the bull in all of these sacred places, and it was a religion. It certainly wasn't just a cult. At that time, what went into eclipse in the West by being reduced and curtailed was the sense of the individual and the sense of the expansive personal. And one finds increasingly, as the generations accrued after the middle of the 300s, you find a regression back into barbarism in the sense that the people have no interest in being individual anymore. They just want to be safe and fit in. They have no inkling of the kaleidoscopic person. They're not interested in that at all. They want to eat and sleep and have sex and be safe and find a place to be sheltered, and that's about it on every level. And one finds, even on the privileged level of very wealthy court people, their personalities shrivel and shrink and become almost little better than soapbox farces that have no sophistication whatsoever. When you read, and you cannot read their writings because almost no one knew how to write. Almost no one knew how to read. The only people that preserved the ability to write and to read were people who were taken out of society and put in special places where they wrote and read, and they were called monasteries. And so for nearly 500 or 700 years, the only people who could read or write were the professional scribes who didn't like life, who didn't participate in it. They were secure and safe in their monasteries, and so reading and writing, symbolic phase, was put into these little, tucked away in these out-of-the-way oases and left there. And you found a vanishing, not only of the phase of vision and the phase of art and the phase of science, and incidentally the phase of history, but also the vanishing of the phase of symbol. And human life went back to a simple, mythic way of paying attention to rituals that were prescribed for you. You fit in. You were in a certain class, you were in a certain gender, you were a certain geographical area, and that's who you were. You were identified by these simple coordinates, and that was it. You must know your place. And for nearly 1,000 years, human beings in the West suffered in this way. A similar situation happened in China. Very, very, very similar. Different way, yet very similar. At one time, in the 800s, there were Taoist sages in the Western Hills outside of Beijing who developed the mathematical skills of calculus. But they used it as esoteric mind training for just a few people, and it was never brought out and learned because science disappeared from Chinese life, largely. So much so that by the early 20th century, people were asking, why, if the Chinese were so smart, didn't they develop science? Why didn't they develop a mathematics? Because they also went through their dark age, dark 1,000 years, where there was a truncation because of an authority that reduced everyone and everything down. You must know your place. This is a Confucian order. If you want to get any place, you take our Confucian exams, which we will grade you in our Confucian way, and we will tell you where you can work, at what level, and if you cross us, you're out. You can join the animals, trying to forage as best you can outside of where we control, which is more and more. And we see in the beginnings of the 21st century a new barbarism. No one reads, no one wants to read, no one wants to write. No one wants to discover. And again, we see the beginnings of a motion which, if not challenged, much less countermanded, will result in a well-known limbo. So this is a learning which doesn't go in for subjects, because the way in which authorities control people is by dicing life up into subjects, which they then say what the criteria are of you knowing something. If you pass our exams in our way, we will let you live where we tell you you can't. And so authority and tyranny begin to have this quality of insidiousness. One of the greatest challenges to all of this, almost reminiscent of 70,000 years ago in South Africa, of the discovery of jewelry and tools, improved tools, happened around the year 1115, around 1115. And for mnemonic, you can just say 1111. In that year, there were two men who had understood that there had been a huge change that had happened in life, that had been building for 100 years at that time, and had built and accumulated to the fact that there was a new level of society that was competently operating for the first time and was going to make a huge effect on life. The two men, one was named Bernard, and he became the abbot of the big monastery in Clairvaux in France. And the other was named Peter Abelard, and he began teaching medieval logic in Paris. And both of them fell in love with women in a very large, conscious, expanded way. Peter Abelard fell in love with a woman named Heloise, and their love letters are the first love letters written in 1,000 years in Europe. And Bernard of Clairvaux fell in love with Hildegard of Bingen, though they corresponded all the time for years and years because they were heads of their monastic places. They couldn't do much about it, but one found Bernard of Clairvaux for the first time in 1,000 years beginning to write commentaries on the only love book in the Bible, the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, which is a series of love lyrics to his beloved. And Bernard of Clairvaux spent about 20 years writing 5 volumes of exquisite appreciation. They're called commentaries in the medieval, but they're appreciations of the subtleties of human love. That there is, if man is in the image of God, then there is in human love also the universal subtleties of the way in which God loves as well in men and women. But that they can only discover it together with each other. I used to say it takes 2 to tango. And so a new quality comes into play, and that is one has to pay attention to relationalities. That other person is as important as you are in any relationality all the time. And so instead of having some kind of a me, that's the center, now you have a proportion. You have a ratioing relationality. And that's not so much the center as it is a double center, so that what you get is a motion that's not even circular, but is elliptical. Elliptical around both of you together in your mutual relationality. And so about the year 1140, 1150, you had for the first time the emergence of a love ethic in Western life that was as strong as the church, as strong as the kingdoms left over from the Roman Empire. And the reason for this, and it was an era where the individual was rediscovered. There are even books on this. There's the discovery of the individual, 1050 to 1200. But it takes its form largely from the 1130s, 1140s. Bernard began his appreciation commentaries on the Song of Solomon about 1135. How did this happen? How did this come about? It came about because in their medieval blockiness, the powerful men, the kings, the warlords, the knights, the men that had weapons and horses and armor and treasure, they realized that the year on the calendar read 1000. And to them, it was that the year 1000 then is the millennium. Well, isn't there something that's supposed to happen in the millennium? Yeah. Jesus is supposed to come back for the millennium. Christ is going to come back for the millennium. Well, where is he going to come? Well, he's certainly not going to come to the outskirts of Paris or to any of these places. He's going to come to the place that he was. He's going to come back in Jerusalem. And so the Crusades were born about the year 1000. And powerful, tough men began raising their armies, making weapons, training the horses, getting the whole thing so that they could take all of the courageous, well-armed young men. Only knights could ride horses. All the other men of their province or their kingdom would have to walk as infantry behind them. And so the creme de la creme of all the powerful men of Europe went off to the Crusades to take the Holy Land back from the Muslims. These are portraits of Schiller at different times recently. This is one of two volumes, Schiller, Poet of Freedom, published by the Schiller Institute. And this was a monograph, one of the few in English on Schiller, published by Paul Karras, who was the head of the Open Court Publishing in Chicago for many, many years. And this is Leslie Sharp's study. Her study of Schiller was the first in 40 years. There are figures who are important, like Schiller, who are national icons in their home countries or in Europe and are hardly mentioned in the United States. But Schiller is extraordinarily important for us because he links the way in which the rediscovery of the individual by women largely in the 12th and early 13th century came to an enormous culmination in the Romantic period. One of the qualities that almost anyone in the world today will recognize, that one of the most fierce, heroic figures is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And the subtitle of Frankenstein in her novel was A Modern Prometheus, about a Superman who was botched because man can't make a Superman that way. A Superman is not tinkered together like a Frankenstein out of parts and then shot full of juice from some generator, from some lightning rod connected to just get raw electricity. You will get a Frankenstein. But he is the ultimate romantic hero who goes astray because he is the first of the man-made men by the new science. Just as if you are refining your tools for the first time, one is now going to refine the tool maker, but not in terms of a learning, not in terms of a maturing, not in terms of an education, but to take dead parts and paste them together and then juice that and think that you're going to have what you planned. And what turns out is a nightmare. For the last 200 years, this has been a bad dream that has been resurfacing again and again with scary intensification, scary expansion, scary sudden repetitions again and again, that contemporary man is turning out Frankensteins on every level, including societies that are like Frankenstein's. Nazi Germany was a Frankenstein. We need to be circumspect to not let the United States become a 21st century Frankenstein. And so we need to have in our maturation, in our learning, ways to appreciate and to achieve the recognition on all the different levels of history, all the different levels of our maturity. And it takes a very refined way to learn. You cannot learn by subjects, because if you try to take just parts of subjects and stitch them together and then energize it by money or political power or authority, you will get a Frankenstein every single time. You will not get personalities. You will get garish pastiches that do not know where they came from because they have no parentage. They have no heritage. They have only an ism plan that now parades as if it were superior. This is unacceptable. It always has been unacceptable. So our learning is by phase, but our phase learning is like the ancient wisdom that held for hundreds of thousands of years. It has its cycles, it has its ecologies. But the ecology of consciousness is a complementarity to the cycle of nature. It moves a different way. Instead of coming together, it differentiates and continues to differentiate, just as integration continues to integrate. And it is true that in the natural ecology, one can come to the final integral, which is the center of the mind, which integrates the entire universe into a pointedness. And one can come to that. There are many powerful techniques to do this, many powerful ways. But the ancient wisdom is that that is not a stopping place. That is a transform, which quickly opens out again and opens out into the vast field of consciousness right away. It doesn't take any time, it takes a twinkling of the eye. And what was the ultimate calm, rest, focus of one's identity in its objectivity, it immediately opens into a vast, something more vast than an ocean. It opens into a universe of alert consciousness, into vision. So our learning by phase is not only to put the phases in the right sequence, it's like getting the sequence of DNA right. If you don't have the sequence, then there's no way that you're going to be able to really understand. You're not going to be able to read out structure, to be able to refine structure. You will end up with pastiches. So the phases here are phases that occur not only in a sequence, but they occur in a syncopation. They pair. They go together. They go together in sets of pairs. And those sets of pairs also pair so that one has not only a phase and then its adjunct phase as a pair. Those pairs pair and you get a square. And we call this a square of attention. It is a quality of naturalness that in order for the mind to think about something clearly, it has to have a frame of reference. It has to have a frame within which the picture is delimited and has an ability to have a structural composition. Otherwise, it doesn't have a form. It doesn't have a shapedness. And it doesn't relate then in any cognate way to the objectivity of existence. Things are what they are existentially, but in the mind, they are there in one's frame of attention, one square of attention. You can move that. You can do things with that. And indeed, with consciousness, you can open it up to be prismatic. But in nature, it is direct that a perception is able to come into a square of attention in the mind that symbolically now is capable of a concept that is objectively related to the percepts, to perception. Otherwise, you cannot see. And the stereoptic way of eyes is universal. There are other ways to have, but most creatures, fish, deer, humans, crabs, flies, 2 eyes. Because the focus, the ability to focus, is the ability to hone perception enough so that one can literally see what you are doing. And the addition of color to perception is very radical. It deepens the quality of being able to see. And any kind of perception then will have this honability, this ability that will have an increased cognate in the symbolic mind in conception, because experience allows for the correlation to go through it. And so experience is not objective, nor is it subjective. The whole thing about saying, well, experience is subjective, is a projection of the deluded mind. Experience is a dynamic process that allows for the objectivity of ritual action things to be in a correlate with symbolic conception, compositions, structures. Our learning here has, because of its phases, because we have a phase of form and then a phase of process, then another phase of form, another phase of process. But when we get to the third process, consciousness, it is a process like nature is a process, or mythic experience is a process, but consciousness is not an integral process, is a differential process. It is not meant to bring together. If there's any meaning to it, it's a process, a dynamic of being able to see further possibilities, further differentiations. So it doesn't group things together. Like ritual actions will group things together. These things go together. Or symbolically, these things go together and stacked in this order, all of that makes a new togetherness, which can be indexed by such and so. The mind can do that. Symbols and rituals are objective in that way. But the kind of objective form that comes out of consciousness is prismatic, like a jewel, and not integral, like things or ideas. And so the person is an art form. The person is a spirit of possibilities, many of which could be realized, some of which would not work out, but all of which belong to the realm of possibility. And so the art of person making is the art of letting your person emerge out of consciousness and not mistaking that what emerges in the mind out of experience is your person. Is a fundamental error. It is an arrogant error. Because what emerges in the mind is an idea of one's identity purely out of experience based on ritual is always egotistical. It's always the ego in a derisive way. It's always the selfishness rather than the self. It is that way. And so when we come in our learning, we need to have the phases which are in the right sequence but syncopated, and syncopated in such a way that they accumulate together, and to realize that there is a limited quality of attention, which means that any 4 phases at any given time is as much as that frame can take in terms of attentiveness. It's not that the other phases then are unconscious or that they're illusory, that they don't exist. It's that they are not in the square of attention. So when consciousness, when vision comes into play, the first phase of that first square of attention goes out of our attention, goes out of that frame of reference, and that is nature. And if you're not alert, you will then think that, well, nature has been overcome and consciousness now can lord it over everything. And this is pride that goes before the fall. This is not true at all. It's that nature agrees, lets, in her mysteriousness, lets consciousness come into play, but instead of nature being the base of your square of attention, it is ritual that's the base. And so as soon as one has visionary capacities, you look to position your attentiveness on an existential action basis. And when the next phase, art, as we will see, comes into play, it is ritual that goes out of the frame of reference. And so the basis of the square of attention that has art and persons, its base is experience, not ritual. Not ritual sequence, not ritual action. And so in order for there to be a person, one has to have an attentiveness that lets both nature and the existential actions of objective doing go out of your square of attention. Now, ritual action always used to be called in ancient India karma. So in order for there to be a spiritual person, you have to let karma no longer be the basis of your attentiveness. It is a very simple thing. Once you have the phase form learning, you'll be able to figure all of these things out for yourself and see why all of this is so valuable and so meaningful. And it isn't because they are good ideas, it's because this is how reality works in this way. Now, it took thousands, tens of thousands of years to understand these phases. No one has just made them up. They have been there, but they need to be redisclosed and in a form of learning, which now is not just for the talented genius or the sacred few, but is available to anyone who will avail themselves of it, planet-wide, star system-wide. It is so new because we have not had it as a basis of our learning for almost 500 years. Before that, when it was rediscovered in the Renaissance, it was rediscovered and it took several hundred years for its rediscovery, from the 12th century to the 15th century. Almost 300 years for it to really percolate and revivify itself, so that there was, again, an understanding of learning on the scale of the universe. And so you had the beginnings of what were called universities in the early 13th century, in the early 1200s. You had the University of Paris, and you had Oxford University in England. You had a couple of universities in northern Italy. But if you look at what they were teaching, their curricula, they're not universities. They're just expanded monastic schools. And there were just a few things that you could do out of it. Even in Schiller's day, there were only a few things, a few tracks that you could follow. You could follow law, you could follow clergy, you could follow medicine, you could follow military, you could follow farming or business, but on very limited levels. Unless you didn't have contacts, you were not going to be successful. So there are periods where the expansiveness becomes available, but it has always been subject to being truncated, to being misappropriated. And again, in the 21st century, we see already the strengths of reduction are everywhere. The strengths of cringing and curtailment of possibilities are everywhere. Because a free population is a threat to anyone who has a limited handhold. A free population will do what they want on their own recognizance, on their own relationalities. And so one sees in someone like Schiller, for his era, the romantic hero is a very special case. He's not the individual who was found in the 1200s and came to fruition in Renaissance man. He goes in a huge jump of orders beyond that. He's not just capable in a lot of different ways. The Renaissance man could write songs, he could fight in warfare, he could conduct business, he knew how to handle himself in every kind of situation, but he could not easily handle himself in face of the unknown, in face of the unexpected. Whereas Schiller's romantic hero is made to go into the unknown, is made to face the entire universe if necessary, to face oneself, to go into nightmares beyond belief and emerge victorious. The romantic hero then becomes a special case of mankind, that he is not content just to be differentially conscious and at home as a spiritual person, but he wants to be at home in the cosmos entire. And so the romantic hero is busy honing himself for a quest into the cosmos. He wants to be at home wherever he will be, regardless of what the situation is. And if there's no situation there, he will use his own talents to create a situation that will be there. And so the romantic hero of Schiller becomes a kaleidoscopic protagonist. He will make his adventures wherever he will go and considers himself free, not free just in choices or free because he has a lot of possibilities, but absolutely, totally free. But he can only emerge out of a process that is more refined even than consciousness. He can only emerge out of historical consciousness. And so cosmic forms, the forms of science, emerge out of that hyper-conscious process called history. And so the romantic hero quests, not in a geography so much, not in an experience so much, not even in his mind so much, and not just in visions, although they're a part of it, but his spiritual person quests in the hyper possibilities of historical objectivity, which will come into form because he will be a participant in the making of that form. And so the spiritual person has a direct relationship to the cosmos, has not a relationship of identity like mind to body, but has a relationship of a harmonic like a person to the cosmos that will objectify persons without end and conditions without end. One of the qualities of Schiller, he didn't live very long. He was quite ill and sickly. But as soon as he was given half a chance, he was told, you can study to be a monk or a priest, or you can study to go into law, or you can study to go into medicine. For your class at this time in Europe, that you can study for those three things, he chose medicine. But as soon as he got his feet into being able to understand medicine, he realized that the health he was interested in was not the health of just the body, but it was the health of the romantic hero. And so right away he started writing plays. He started writing dramas. And of course, because the romantic hero is always challenging the social order in a very radical way, his first great drama was called The Robbers. Yeah, that was a huge success. And within a couple of years, he realized that he was being persona non grata with all the social realms and would have perished if he hadn't had a few friends, a few patrons to help off keeping him from doom and dissolution and death. And it was just always a handful of people who helped Schiller through his short life. One of the biggest helps to him was Goethe. Goethe was the mastermind of the age, but in an Enlightenment form. He was older by a whole generation or so. He belonged to the realm of Benjamin Franklin, whereas Schiller belonged to the realm of like a Shelley. A different emphasis, a different quality. Goethe made sure eventually that Schiller was appointed as a professor of philosophy of history nearby to where he was in Weimar. He was the prime minister of the little duchy of Weimar, and Jena was a university town not too far from it. And when Schiller went there and was recently married, all of a sudden you find Schiller being lionized because he understood that he may not live very long, and so he needed to shine as bright as he could, as fast as he could. One of his poems is called Ode to Joy, which is the text of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Other works of his are works that came out, and we're taking one of them, on the aesthetic education of man. There are 27 letters, ostensibly to a young man, to tell him about the universe, to tell him about the cosmos, to tell him about his heroic romantic self, if he will take that seriously, but that it takes a preparation, not just to get there, but to mature to that. And it's in the maturing to that with care that one comes to see it isn't that there's something that you must do, like a destiny. A destiny is a poor substitute for freedom. There's anything that you can do, but the clues to what you will do are like seeds that grow in the maturation, and something that begins to grow will grow out of mysterious nature, out of clues that are there in your existence, out of emphasis of character in your experience, out of ways in which your mind starts to figure these things together. And then in a vision, you will see the spread of all of those, not together, but in the fan of possibilities. And out of that, your person will begin to choose directions that need nourishing. These are conscious possibilities. And out of that, then the romantic hero will begin to assemble what he needs for his exploration, to go into the unknown, to go into freedom itself, the biggest unknown of all. One is not only free, one is free to be free. He says, in the aesthetic letters of, that there is something in art then, the art of person-making, the spiritual art of person-making, that is distinctly different from ideas of art. So that an aesthetic that somebody manufactures in their mind will only be half the story. That half of the story will come out of one's experience. Your ideas of beauty, your ideas of person, your ideas of who you are by your individuality count, but they're only halfway there. The other half must emerge out of vision, visionary consciousness. And so if the romantic hero doesn't engender the ability to behold visionary consciousness, the whole other complement to experience will not occur, because the person will come out of the visionary consciousness, just like your individuality came out of experience. And when they come together and weave together in a complementarity, you get the full person. You get the mind as a part of the spiritual person. And they go together. Jacob Bronowski in The Ascent of Man says something interesting about the mind. He says the hand is the cutting edge of the mind, and this is true. What the hand can do is very much a key to the structure of what the mind can do. But the mind is the key for what the person can achieve and be in just that way. And so one has to learn that it isn't just the hand to mouth that feeds you so that you can live by the idea that you have, but the mind also now has to agree not to be the boss, but to be a tool, a very sophisticated tool, maybe a whole toolbox. But it is not a tool for itself. It's authority. It's a tool for the conscious, spiritual, artistic person to use. And so the mind has to stop being the lord of the manor and to start being hired help. Start being in service. Start helping. And let the spiritual person, in their visioning, give the direction and take the guide. Not control, but guidance. And so the person becomes able to navigate through a much more complex world towards a cosmic home, rather than just to figure out what's the power way to get quickest, most, and keep it from others. And so the whole quality of the romantic hero becomes an enormous challenge. And Schiller is one of the first to really be able to spell it out. And he says the key to it is to understand an aesthetic is not a philosophy of art in the mind. An aesthetic is the artistic achievement from the person in their own vision. And that one must acclimate to this, that the Enlightenment figures like Goethe were all about the mind being clear. And that consciousness is just a part of what then the mind commandeers, where it is the other way around. The mind is part of the toolbox which the person can use, not just to make things, but to create. And so the creative imagination is a part of vision. It isn't just imaging in the mind. If one left images in the mind, that's just like a simple recording. Even machines can do that. They can record images. The material that came back from Titan were electronic signals that were recorded, not even on magnetic tape, but put together in modern imaging systems and sent direct. And if you decode all of that, then you can get something like an objective image out of it. Whereas if there were a romantic hero on Titan, he would see kaleidoscopically everything, and not just a record of some group pastiche of signals making an image, and would see himself there. This is different. If all of your energy and all of your money and all of your time goes in to making machines sophisticated while human beings truncate, then you will get a very lonely, sophisticated machine culture and very stupid people who don't do anything and don't go anywhere, especially into themselves. More next week.